Why the ecological approach is bullshit. The ecological approach destroys jiu-jitsu.
I've been working on a documentary about ecological dynamics for the last 18 months. There's three major issues with these arguments that I want to talk about today. First, let's agree on some common ground, which is that in both approaches, coaches and sparring are incredibly important. The first issue is there are dozens of peer-reviewed studies comparing ecological dynamics approaches to traditional expert instruction, and they nearly universally show that ecological dynamics outperforms the traditional approach in a wide variety of sports, even with no prescriptive instruction or feedback.
All of jiu-jitsu is knowledge being passed through by generations. What my instructor has taught me has been taught by his instructor, and then his instructor, and then refined over the years. If we started the ecological approach hundreds of years ago, no technique would have ever been discovered.
The second issue is what techniques are. Traditional coaching like Dan and his coach John Danaher use is based on a framework we collectively call information processing, where a performer needs to store, choose, and recall motor programs to perform movements. That's why coaches traditionally teach you moves, when to do them, how to think about them, and have you drill them repetitively to their standard of perfection, because they're operating in a paradigm where your sensory systems need assistance to figure out what's going on, and your brain can store movement patterns for later recall. That's why Dan is saying that techniques are knowledge passed down by instructors. In ecological dynamics, movement patterns are like ink mixing in water. How the ink mixes with the water is incredibly complex. It's determined by the inherent properties of the inks, the water, and how they're brought together. In the same way, the movements that emerge when two grapplers engage each other are incredibly complex and have to do with the inherent properties of each grappler, their tasks, and the surrounding environment. In ecological dynamics, you don't study the performer in isolation from the environment. You study the performer-environment complex as the fundamental unit of analysis. Here, techniques are just collections of similar patterns of movement that tend to emerge from the relationship between the performers and the environment. We believe with strong evidence that it's much more productive to allow or even force these movements to emerge for the functional purposes they are designed to serve, rather than to teach them prescriptively and drill them passively. For instance, you could teach the knee slide as a series of movements and have people do hundreds of reps against a partner who attempts to give you the correct opportunity to do a knee slide. But it's completely different than doing a knee slide against a partner who is attempting to not give you any opportunity to pass the guard. Instead, you could simply put your students in a situation where the knee slide is their best option and have them work to pass the guard against resistance. And you will be amazed how quickly and effectively they will learn it. Or you could put students in a situation where they have to pass the guard against resistance, and some will learn to knee slide, while others may use other movements that are more effective for them in the situation they are facing. There's a very simple study from Rob Gray that supports this point. You have very skilled baseball players that you want to hit the ball higher. He tells one group the best cues he got from interviewing 3 expert hitting coaches for how to hit the ball higher. He gives the other group barriers that they have to hit the ball over, with no other instruction or feedback. The group with the barriers does significantly better because they are focused on the function that the technique is designed to create, hitting the ball higher. You have to hit the ball higher to get it over the barrier.
That completely undermines everything we know about learning. It has a lack of structured skill development. Think about this for a second. You do a technique and it works, but it's not the most efficient way. But then you do it over and over again, drilling it incorrectly just because it happens to work for you, but it's not the most efficient way of doing something. How do you know if it's an efficient technique? Because you have all these years of refinement from your instructor, your instructor's instructor.
There's a big shift here. In ecological dynamics, we treat the environment as the main teacher, and the coach is a facilitator of that learning that helps you search through an ocean of important information. Rather than assuming the coach knows the perfect details in any situation, look to the environment and see if it works. If your movements are ineffective, they won't work against full resistance of a skilled opponent. If they work, not only do you not need a coach to micromanage details of your techniques, both old and new models of motor learning are consistent in that this is not the most effective way to learn. See Optimal Theory for more on that.
Not everybody learns the same way. Some people do better with law live training. A lot of people learn better from being taught something. You can't have one type of approach for everybody and tout something as the end-all be-all for instruction in jiu-jitsu.
Personally, I hear this argument a lot, and I have a judgment that this is a bit of a cop-out to avoid doing all the work of legitimately learning about ecological dynamics, which honestly is fair. The original research on learning styles only ever showed that people had preferences for different learning styles, not that they actually learned better with them. Further, the research shows that people learn better with ecological dynamics. So forgive me if I wait for research showing male college-educated Filipino Americans learn ping pong better with prescriptive instruction before we start talking about individual learning styles.
Think about it for 1 second. What are all the best teams in the world doing? Let's talk about the best teams. New Wave, B Team, Fight Sports, Atos, Allianz, Checkmat. They're all doing the same thing. If the ecological approach was really that good, because all it is constraint-based training, wouldn't all of the top teams figure out that this is the best thing for us to do? Of course not. Everybody who's won anything in ADCC, IBJJF, or whatnot, they're not doing it because it's nonsense.
People at the top of any field are often resistant to change because doing what they did led them to success. Who could blame them? This is just an argument for the status quo in a world where 99.9% or more of martial arts schools use prescriptive instruction. But the people who stay at the top are the people who adapt and adopt new technologies and paradigms as they're invented. The NBA, NFL, MLB, and many pro sports teams have already hired skill acquisition specialists that are well-versed in ecological dynamics.
Also, why would I be experimenting with something when there's already a proven technique system in place already that works at the highest level? On top of that, anybody could be a coach for the ecological approach. You could just have a bunch of people on the mats and just say, okay, roll out of these positions and figure it out. But a real coach is going to tell you the things that he's learned over the years and years of him training that works the best.
Just because we're not teaching detailed techniques step by step doesn't mean that there isn't a huge amount of skill involved with coaching with the CLA. It's just different. I think a lot of traditional coaches have a huge emotional reaction to the idea of not teaching techniques, thinking that this is an attack on their profession and the value of coaching. It absolutely isn't. But ecological dynamics doesn't mean you can't teach moves or give details here and there. It just means that that's a generally less productive way of doing things based on an outdated model. The real problem that ecological dynamics proposes is the drilling and the repetition for aesthetic accuracy of what should be functional movements in rehearsed scenarios. If you believe that the brain doesn't store or recall any generalized motor programs, then drilling movements repetitively against passive partners is a total waste of time in comparison to working against resistance in a well-designed task. If you don't believe me, you'd still have to explain why studies using the CLA and differential learning are consistently winning in the literature, and overturn what is now over 50 years of foundational research. I'll explain everything much more in depth in my upcoming documentary, so subscribe to my YouTube channel to see it when it comes out. I want to thank Big Dan for posting this video, doing a debate with productive intentions, and making his viewpoints clear.